So picture this. It's 1928. Jiang Jieshi has just won the Northern Expedition. The warlords are, for the most part, defeated. China looks like it's finally united. And there's a new government in Nanjing promising a bright, modern future. But here's the big question. Was this the revolution Sun Yat-sen actually dreamed of? Or was it something else entirely? Well, that's what we're here to figure out.
So, how do you even begin to answer a question that big? Especially for those of you studying IB history. You know that a simple timeline of events just isn't going to cut it. You need a framework, right? A way to actually measure success. And probably the best way to do that is to judge Jiang's government by the very standards it's set for itself.
And lucky for us, we have the perfect standard. Sun Yat-sen's own ideology, the Three People's Principles. Think of this as our yardstick. We're going to hold Jiang's actions up to each of these principles and ask some tough questions. Did he actually deliver on nationalism? Did he make any real moves toward democracy? And did he do anything to improve the people's livelihood? All right, so here's our game plan. We'll start by quickly setting the scene in Nanjing. Then we're going to run our three big tests: nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. And after all that, we'll see if we can reach a final verdict. It's a really clear way to structure a solid historical analysis. Okay, let's set that scene. Jiang Jieshi consolidates his power and sets up his new capital in Nanjing. But you have to understand, this was not some peaceful transition of power. He violently, brutally purges the communists, completely shattering the First United Front. And that act right there tells you something absolutely crucial. This revolution is about to take a very sharp turn to the right. And that right there is the key takeaway from the get-go. The Nanjing government wasn't a government of broad unity. No way. It was a victory for the GMD's conservative right-wing faction. The communists were out, and so were the GMD's own left-wing members. They were all violently suppressed. This decision to exclude so many people is going to define everything that happens over the next decade. First up, let's test for nationalism. Sun Yat-sen's biggest dream was a strong, independent, united China, one that was free from foreign meddling and all the internal fighting. So did Jiang's government actually deliver on that? Let's see.
And what you see immediately is this massive contradiction. I mean, on one hand, you have to give him some credit, right? He did end the worst of the warlord era and his government got international recognition. But on the other hand, was China really united? Not really. It was kind of an illusion. Foreign powers still had huge economic and military influence. He didn't actually control a lot of the provinces. And maybe most importantly, he completely failed to win over the hearts and minds of the vast majority of people in the countryside.
And just listen to this quote from Jiang himself. This is him talking about his big initiative, the New Life movement. It tells you everything about his vision for nationalism. It wasn't about empowering people from the ground up. It was about top-down military discipline, order, and being ready to die for the state. A very different vision of national strength. 4.5%? Seriously, just let that number sink in for a second. That's the tiny, tiny fraction of the urban population that the GMD, the Kuomintang, actually represented. You simply cannot build a nation when you ignore over 95% of your own people. This one stat just completely blows apart any claim the GMD had to being a truly national party. And of course, it left a huge vacuum in the countryside that the communists were more than happy to fill. Okay, let's move on to our second test, democracy. Now, Sun Yat-sen's plan called for something called a period of tutelage, basically a phase where the GMD would act like a teacher, educating people about democracy before finally handing over power. So the question is, was Jiang a teacher, or was he a tyrant?
And here, the gap between the promise and the reality is just massive. I mean, they did announce the period of tutelage, checking that box from Sun's plan, but instead of actually teaching people about democracy, they built a system that was all about total control.
When you look at the evidence, the stuff in the for column is, well, it's pretty much just for show. Yeah, they set up a 5-power government on paper, but the against column shows you what was really happening. Power wasn't in those institutions. It was in Jiang's personal military cliques. He relied on the secret police force. He crushed anyone who disagreed with him. And he even said he admired European fascism. The whole tutelage thing, it was basically a fiction. And these were the actual tools of his control. A terrifying secret police run by a guy named Dai Li, one of Jiang's most loyal cadets from the Whampoa Military Academy. You didn't debate political opponents. You had them arrested or even assassinated.
And then you had paramilitary groups like the Blue Shirts, who enforced loyalty through fear and intimidation. I mean, come on. These are not the tools of a democratic teacher. They're the tools of a dictator. All right, on to our final test, people's livelihood. Now, this was always Sun's most vague principle, but it really boils down to one simple idea: improving the economic well-being of ordinary people, probably through something like land reform. So did Chiang deliver on this really fundamental promise? And we see the same pattern here, don't we? The 4 column is all talk. It's all about surface-level stuff. The New Life movement had a lot of rhetoric about improving life through things like hygiene and order. But the against column is about substance, about what really matters. There was no meaningful land reform. The GMD's base of support was the wealthy city elites, not the poor farmers. In fact, economic inequality actually got worse under their rule. And this right here gets to the absolute heart of the matter. Chiang tried to solve a massive structural economic problem, crushing rural poverty, with a moral crusade. He was lecturing peasants about being clean and saving money when what they desperately needed was land and economic reform. He fundamentally failed to even understand the problem, let alone solve it. So we've run our 3 tests. We've looked at the evidence. What's the final verdict on the Nanjing decade? Let's try and put it all together. What you see when you step back is a government that is just completely defined by its contradictions. He was a unifier who ruled like a dictator, a modernizer who brought back old Confucian traditions, a nationalist who was still totally dependent on foreign powers. But the biggest one, the most important one, is the gap between the stated ideals of his party and the authoritarian reality of his rule. For any of you writing an essay on this, these contradictions are the key tensions you want to explore. So, the final judgment seems pretty clear. When Jiang Jieshi was faced with a choice between Sun Yat-sen's revolutionary principles and his own personal grip on power, he chose power. Every single time. His government really only served the military and a tiny group of city elites. And by doing that, he created this vast sea of unhappy, discontented peasants that the Chinese Communist Party would become very, very good at mobilizing. And this leaves us with this really crucial historical debate. So what was he? Was Jiang a flawed nation builder, maybe just doing what he thought was necessary during a time of incredible crisis? Or was he an authoritarian leader whose betrayal of his own party's ideals didn't just undermine a revolution, but actually created the very conditions for the communist victory that would come later? That's the real question at the heart of his legacy.